Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 7th Annual Bay Area Book Festival. I am Brooke Warner, current board chair of the festival, and I am delighted to be opening our 9-day literary extravaganza tonight. We're coming to you from Berkeley, land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, and we invite you to share in the chat the native land where you're joining us from, and thank you. I also want to take a moment to thank the sponsors of tonight's event, which include the San Francisco Chronicle, Mother Jones Magazine, and my publishing house, She Writes Press, along with the many other supporters of the festival who've enabled this event to come to you at no cost. We've decided to launch this year's festival with a conversation on one of the most urgent tasks we face right now as a society, indeed, as a human community, which is to eliminate racial profiling, hate crimes, cruelty to immigrants and refugees, and other injustices that arise when we see anyone unlike ourselves as the other, whether that's due to skin color, heritage, religion, sexual orientation, or the many other ways in which we're all different from one another, and gloriously so. Tonight's program, See No Stranger, A Radical Vision for Mending Our World, goes straight to the heart of the solution. Our featured author is renowned civil rights activist, passionate speaker, interfaith leader, and mother, Valarie Kaur. Valarie began to devote her life to social justice when, in the wake of 9/11, a close family friend was killed in a hate crime. The daughter of Sikh farmers in California's heartland, Valarie earned degrees at Stanford, Harvard Divinity School, and Yale Law School. She began to win policy changes on multiple fronts, not only where hate crimes were concerned, but on issues of racial profiling, immigration detention, solitary confinement, internet freedom, and more. She's founded several organizations, made award-winning films, and became a commentator in top news outlets. Valarie burst into the broader American consciousness in the wake of the 2016 election when her watch night service address at Reverend William Barber's church went viral with 40 million views worldwide. And we'll let her tell you more about her major new project to create justice in America. But the title of her amazing book, See No Stranger, a memoir and manifesto of revolutionary love, will give you a clue. I absolutely love this book. I've read it, I've listened to it on Audible, and Valarie herself is the wonderful narrator, so I hope that you'll, like me, buy it in 2 formats. Tonight, Valarie will be in conversation with Jamilah King, the race and justice reporter at Mother Jones, and the host of the Mother Jones podcast. Jamilah writes about the intersection of race, politics, and culture, and she's also led coverage as senior staff writer at Mike and as a senior editor at Color Lines. She's been seen, heard, and read everywhere, from the Washington Post to NPR to CNN. Now I'll turn it over to Jamilah. We're in for such a treat. Enjoy the conversation, everyone.
Thank you so much, Brooke. I'm Jamilah King, and I'll be your moderator. I'm joining you today from Lenape land, otherwise known as Brooklyn, New York. And I'm so excited to be talking with Valarie. So Valarie, I first want to invite you to help lead us in taking a breath, because this moment is really heavy for a lot of us.
Thank you, Jamilah. Thank you, Brooke. Thank you, Bay Area Book Festival. And thank you to all of you who are here today. I agree, Jamilah, this moment, we are living through an extraordinary time in our nation, in our world, in our own lives. And so my invitation to you all is to imagine this conversation as a place where you can gain nourishment and clarity about how you might want to show up now and next. So to begin with a breath, I invite you to place your feet on the earth and notice the difference between holding your body up and letting the earth hold you up. And in this moment, you can close your eyes or lower your eyes and just let yourself arrive. Taking a deep breath in, let it come, let it go. Turning your attention inward with a sense of curiosity. What are you holding in your body in this moment? Notice the shape of grief in your body. Where is grief living in you? Without trying to change it, just notice it. Noticing the shape of rage in your body. Without shame, honor your rage. Notice where it's living in your body in this moment. And if you are finding that you're not feeling very much at all, if you are numb, know it's okay to be numb. No one body can process everything that's happening in the world in this moment. But as a community, we can bear it together. The fact that you are here tonight means that you have not let your numbness turn into paralysis. You are here. You are showing up in conversation. So honor that in you. And you are not alone. So in the next moment, I invite you to imagine roots beneath the earth, connecting you to me, to Jamilah, all across the country. We are like trees in the forest. We look as though we are standing apart, but we are interconnected. We are interdependent. And so we can send each other nourishment and energy that we might need in this moment. Picture that. And finally, I invite you to imagine the ancestors who walked on the land beneath your feet. For me, it's the Tongva people. For Jamilah, the Lenape. Who is it for you? Imagine their struggle, their resilience, past, present, and future. And finally, I invite you to think of an ancestor who makes you brave. It can be someone from your own family line or someone from history. Just choose one. Imagine them behind you now. Notice now what bravery feels like in your body. Now, my loves, in our bodies, with a sense of connection through this earth, with ancestors at our backs, now I invite you to take one final deep breath. Are you ready? Let it come. Let it go. From this place, let us have our conversation tonight.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Valarie. That was so powerful. So before we get into the book, I want to just take a piece of what you talked about, which is where grief lives in our body. Today, there was a vigil in Indianapolis for 8 people who were murdered in a mass shooting. Obviously, this was an awful thing to have happened, particularly to the Sikh community. These were Sikh community members who were killed. And you participated in this vigil. Can you talk a little bit about why it was important to grieve these losses publicly?
Oh, Jamilah, now you know. I had you all breathe with me because I needed to breathe. I needed to find the grief in my body right now. It's been 2 weeks since the mass shooting in Indianapolis. And yes, 4 of the 8 killed were Sikh Americans. What most people don't know is that facility, that FedEx facility where the gunman opened fire, was primarily staffed by Sikh employees. This was a place where our elders felt safe to wear traditional clothing, turbans, beards, chunnis, to speak in Punjabi, to eat Punjabi food. And it was here where the gunman decided to open fire. And we are receiving eyewitness accounts that he specifically targeted Sikhs during the rampage, that he hunted us. He is also known to have visited white supremacist sites. So whether or not this atrocity is ever officially classified as a hate crime, what I want you to know, what I need you to know, is that the impact on our community has been nearly identical. Not just for Sikhs in Indianapolis, but all across the country. People have been increasing security at the Gurdwaras. Our Vaisakhi celebrations turned into memorials this last weekend. Trauma services deployed, parents like me drawing our children close. it opened up the racial wound of all the trauma that we have held in our bodies since the last time Sikhs were massacred on this scale in Oak Creek, Wisconsin in 2012, and really the hate violence that has gone on for the last 20 years since 9/11, and, truly long before that. But there have been no headlines, very few headlines, right? There have been no hashtags. There's been no visible solidarity that erupted on its own. And so, Jamilah, the thing that I realized that was different for me, because I've been in this work for 20 years. Balbir uncle, Balbir Singh Sodhi, was the first person killed in a hate crime after 9/11. I was a college student. His murder turned me into an activist, and it's been 20 years. 20 years from a college kid now to a mother, and we are responding to the same white supremacist violence. That hasn't changed, but we have changed. I have looked to my Black and Indigenous sisters and elders and understood the kind of resilience that's required in the face of atrocity that goes on for decades and for centuries. And I've come to understand that solidarity is survival. That the only way that we will be able to transition America into a multiracial democracy is if every one of us sees a stake in it. And when I say solidarity, I don't mean shallow solidarity. Logic of exchange. I show up for your people, Jamilah, you show up for mine, right? Like you do this and I do. No, I'm talking about deep solidarity. And deep solidarity is rooted in the recognition that we belong to one another, that we are sisters and brothers and siblings, that it's rooted in love. Because if I show up for you because I love you, then I will have the energy to keep doing so long after the media cameras have left. So yes, we hosted a solidarity vigil where 10,000 people joined us online, and faith leaders and movement leaders and artists and activists. And we modeled a way to stand with Sikhs, center Black lives, because there's no collective liberation without Black liberation, begin with Indigenous histories and memories in the way that we did in our hour together, for they have already survived the apocalypse. They have something to tell us about how we get through this era that we're in. And we invited white people and people of privilege to show up with us, not just as allies, but as accomplices, people who conspire with us to reorder the world. And Jamilah, in doing so, we embodied the beloved community. We embodied what America could be, a multiracial, multi-faith nation. So I appreciate having this conversation tonight, because we get to roll up our sleeves and say, okay, but how? If the atrocities keep happening, then how? How do we build it, not just in the face of atrocity, but where we are every day? How do we use our lifetime for that purpose?
Thank you for that. Early on in your book, you write that wonder is where love begins, but the failure to wonder is the beginning of violence. Obviously, we are living in a time of profound violence, whether it's violence by the state, interpersonal violence as a result of hate, or violence of a pandemic that is very much still decimating our communities across the globe. How do you practice wonder? Are there questions you should ask? Are there questions you should ask yourself or the people around you? How do you make it into a practice?
The practice I invite people into is this. You can look upon the face of anyone around you and say, you are a part of me I do not yet know. You are a part of me I do not yet know. It's an orientation of humility and surrender. It's not oneness as sameness. No, it's oneness that opens us up into the wonder of one another. For if I see you as sister, brother, sibling, if I see you as a part of me I do not yet know, then I can open myself to your story. I can let your grief into my heart. And in grieving with you, I can gain the information for how I might show up with you when you are in harm's way. That's the kind of ethic of love that we need now. The call to love is so ancient, Jamilah. I've come out with this, revolutionary love is the call of our times, as if it's this new framework. And the framework we'll be talking about tonight is new. Oh, but it is ancient, isn't it? We have heard the call to love without limit for centuries, through the millennia, Jesus called us to love thy neighbor, and Muhammad to take in the orphan, and Abraham to open our tent to all, and Buddha to practice unending compassion. That this call to love without limit, to expand the circle of who counts as one of us, to include all of us, that is so ancient. And this recognition of our oneness, isn't it increasingly verified by science? Like, we are made of the stuff that was furnaced in the bellies of long dead stars. We're breathing the same air, the atoms that circulated in our ancestors, that we can look upon anyone and say, not just as a spiritual truth, but as a biological fact, a cosmological fact. You are a part of me I do not yet know. Why is it then, if the call to love is so ancient, that we live in societies that are this divided and this unequal? And I think about it, Jamilah, and I think every society has been organized by a hierarchy of human value, run by institutions that cling to hierarchies of human value to preserve the interests of one group of people over another. And the oldest story, the oldest hierarchy of human value on US soil is that of white supremacy. Our institutions were built on it, profit from it, authorize it, radicalize it. Yes, we have Atlanta and Indianapolis and the insurrection on the 6th, but really, those are just the most visible explosions of the kind of way that our country relies on us to see. Hierarchies of human value depend on a failure of imagination. The only way you can deport or ban or incarcerate entire groups of people of color is if you've trained a society to see them as less than you, as inferior, as deserving it. So what I'm inviting people into is this, that we know that sound government is necessary. We know that. We know we need policy change. We have learned that well, haven't we? And yet we also know that government alone is not sufficient to transition this nation, that we need a shift in culture and consciousness, a revolution of the heart. And that is block by block work. That is heart to heart work. So when I say revolutionary love is the call of our times, it's inviting people to train their eye to see differently, to see no stranger. And if love is more than a rush of feeling, if love is labor, then love can be taught, love can be modeled, and love can be practiced. What if we could teach each other to wonder? What if we can make sure our children don't lose the capacity to wonder? Might we then preserve wonder as the building block for love and for justice in this country?
You talked about love as labor. A lot of us think of love as a feeling, right? It's just something you have or you don't. What does it mean for love to be labor?
Oh, Jamilah, I remember the moment my son was placed on my chest. He was born, that delicious feeling I was just shaking and sobbing from like the rush of oxytocin in my body. I was like overcome with this feeling, and I was like, this is love. I am falling in love. And there's falling in love, right? There's that rush, the flood of emotion that everyone should experience in their lives. But while I was going through that, my mother was standing next to me and opening up her bag and taking out her dal and chol and proceeding to feed me, like feeding her baby while I'm feeding mine. And I look at my mother and I'm like, oh, she knew what I was just beginning to learn, that love is more than the feeling, in the pop songs and the chick flicks and the Hallmark cards. Like, the feelings come and go. Truly, any long marriage, someone will tell you, my husband for 17 years, the feelings come and go, my love. It's what sustains it. In any long-term relationship is the ongoing practical care. Love is labor. It is sweet. It is bloody. It is imperfect. It's life-giving. It's this choice that we make again and again and again. And that means it contains all of the emotions, right? Joy is the gift of love, and grief is the price of love, and anger, right? Anger is not the opposite of love. Our rage is the force that protects that which we love. So part of my work and part of our project is to reclaim love as an ethic, as a practice, as a revolutionary force in this country that we can all practice where we are.
So you write about revolutionary love. I know that you have some exciting work on that specifically in the works. Can you talk a little bit about how to actually practice that labor of revolutionary love?
Yes. And can I tell you before I dive into the practices, like how I came to it?
Yes, please do.
Because I realize like it's the story of this book as well. It's the story of See No Stranger. So, I become an activist when I'm 20. I'm just in crisis response. I'm pushing. I think every film, every lawsuit, every campaign, like we're making the country safer for the next generation. And, 4 years ago, this last president takes power and hate violence is skyrocketing. I just become a new mother. So I'm sitting with my son, and realizing that he's growing up in a nation more dangerous for him than it was for me. And I have this absolute crisis. And I ask this question, the future is dark. What if this darkness is not the darkness of the tomb, but the darkness of the womb? What if our America is not dead, but a country still waiting to be born? The midwife says to breathe and to push. Oh, Jamilah, I delivered those words at Reverend Barbara's church, and they echoed around the world. And I got thousands of letters from people saying, okay, I'm in, I'm ready to breathe, I'm ready to push, but how? How do I breathe? How do I last in the labor for justice if it is this endless? And to be honest, I was losing it myself. I didn't know how I was going to go on because I never learned how to breathe. I only learned the push. So I got a gift that very few women who are mothers and activists are ever given. I between the election and the inauguration, I wrote my book proposal, Revolutionary Love is the Call of Our Times. And I'd been trying to write this book really, truly for 18 years since I was in college. And proposal after proposal, agent after agent, people said there was no audience, there was no voice. This was important work, good girl, but no one would care. No one cares about your people, your community, these ideas. And thank God, on all those years, it took Chris Jackson to become publisher at One World, and he has been credited for single-handedly giving rise to the Black literary movement in this country, from Ta-Nehisi to Bryan Stevenson to on and on. And so this proposal landed on Chris's desk, and he saw Revolutionary Love as a cultural intervention. And I got enough of an advance to step back from the front lines, and I moved my family to the rainforest in Central America for a whole year. And the rainforest was like a womb. My husband's like, don't you have any other metaphors? I'm like, I know. I just said it's very alive for me. But it was like warm and wet and safe and generative. And I felt like I was rebirthing myself there in the rainforest. I read everything I'd ever written since the age of 7. I've kept a journal since 7. I read all the texts from divinity school and law school that I accrued over the years. I read through wisdom traditions and social movements. And Jamilah, it was there in the rainforest, like searching for the answer of how, that I began to see these patterns and practices that I've come to call revolutionary love. So I'm back in the country. I'm back with this offering, this framework for how to practice love as a revolutionary force. And I developed it to save my own life, to find longevity in the struggle. And my hope is that it gives others that support too. So with that introduction, should I talk you through it?
Yes, please do.
Okay, so I imagine these 10 practices of revolutionary love as points on a compass. And you can all see this slide. There we go. So I know it's overwhelming, but I'm going to talk you through it knowing that there's a place where you all can go to really have a deep dive. So imagine pointing the compass to others. So there's an other in front of you. How do you practice revolutionary love for them? That practice is called See No Stranger. See No Stranger. Nako Bedi Nehi Bagana, inspired by Guru Nanak, the founder of the Sikh faith. See No Stranger. It begins with wonder. You are a part of me I do not yet know. I will hear your story. And once I let that story into my heart, that next practice is called grieve. In this country, we think we need to fix it or find the right words, but there is no fixing grief. There's only bearing it. And that alone is an act of justice, because when you are with people in pain, you gain information for how to fight for them. You don't have to know people in order to grieve with them. You grieve with them in order to know them. And so even in the wake of Indianapolis, those who have chosen to grieve with the Sikh community have gained information for how to fight for us, the policies that are important to us, the recognition that is important to us, the relationships that are important to us. Wondering and grieving and fighting, these are the ingredients for the deep solidarity I was speaking about, the deep solidarity that sustains movements for justice. But I notice I always will practice this with my own children. I have to wonder about my kids every day to figure out how to care for them. I often have to grieve with them, teach them how when they something that they can't get. And in this world between pandemic and the hate violence, I have to fight to protect them. So wondering and grieving and fighting is how we practice the love ethic for others. But what happens when, the folks we are fighting are the ones in front of us? What happens when we face our opponents? And so I turn the compass to our opponents. And that practice I call tend the wound. Tend the wound. Here's the truth. And I've written these stories and see no stranger. I've sat with white supremacists and prison guards and soldiers and my own former abusers, even the man who killed Bulbir uncle 20 years ago. And as much as I want to hate them, as much as I have hated them, anytime I choose to wonder about them, I realize that there are no such thing as monsters in this world. Only human beings who are wounded, who act out of their insecurity or blindness or greed or rage. That does not make them any less dangerous. But when I see the wound in them, I become a smarter advocate. See, tending the wound is not just moral, it is strategic, it is pragmatic. It points us to the cultures and the institutions that radicalize our opponents. So the gunman in Indianapolis, I have to ask myself who put the gun in his hands, what policies allowed that to happen, what lawmakers, what websites was he on, what echo chambers, what algorithms, what was feeding the atrocity he committed, and how can I then focus on the context that allows harm to go on and on and on. So that's the logic behind tending the wound. But it begins, you see that first practice in the middle, in the very, very center there? It begins with rage. It begins with tending our own wound, right? Love is not the opposite of rage. The opposite of love is indifference. Rage is the force that protects that which we love. We need to honor our rage. Our rage, Audre Lorde says, our rage is loaded with information and energy. The solution is not to suppress it or to let it explode, but to process it in safe containers where it doesn't hurt others or ourselves. So what are your safe containers for rage? How do you, and our ancestors knew this, right? The shaking, the screaming, the wailing, the dancing, the drumming, like how do we move that energy through us? And then when it's on the outside of us, we can be in relationship with it. We can ask ourselves, what information does this carry? What does it say about how I want to harness this into what I do next? So processing our rage is vital in the act of choosing to love our opponents, because when we do move to that second practice to listen to them, we are not blinded by our hate or rage. And listening to our opponents, our task is not to change them or persuade them, but to understand them. In understanding our opponents, we are gaining the information we need for that next practice, which is called reimagine. Oh, we can resist, and resist. Didn't we call ourselves the resistance, Jamilah? I think I have t-shirts in my closet. No resistance. I was so proud of us. Yes, we are surviving, we are resisting, but I was also so worried. If we're only resisting, we're actually not birthing anything new. We're not changing the world around us with our own imagination. And so to protect spaces in our movements, in our homes, in our lives, to reimagine the world as it ought to be, what is beloved community to you? And to take the information we have from tending our wounds and our opponents to do that reimagining work. That is the practice of loving one's opponent. The raging and the listening and the reimagining. But I want to be very clear about this. It took me 15 years to reach out to my uncle's, to Bulbir uncle's murderer. 15 years of sitting in the rage and the grief before I could even wonder about him. If you are someone who has a knee on your neck right now, it is not your role necessarily to look up at your opponent and try to wonder about them or listen to them. Your role, my love, is to stay alive, to take the next breath. That is your revolutionary act. But if you are someone who is safe enough by virtue of your skin color or your privilege to listen to those kinds of opponents, then we need you now. At any given time, we have a different role in the movement. Revolutionary love it's not the sacrifice of an individual, it's the practice of a community. And so What is your role? Like, where do you need to lean in this season? And this practice is long. It goes over a lifetime. And that's why I'm turning the compass one final direction to ourselves. So social reformers through history, from Gandhi to King to Mandela, they talked a lot about how to love others and love opponents, but they didn't teach at length about how to love ourselves. This is the feminist intervention. These are the Black women, Audre Lorde, bell hooks. They teach us that loving ourselves, the movements cannot happen on our backs or over our dead bodies anymore. We got to be breathing. And the wisdom of the midwife, she has something to teach us about how to sustain longevity through any creative labor. Any labor, whether it's raising a family or building a movement or birthing a nation. She doesn't say breathe once and push the rest of the way. No, she says breathe, my love, and then push and then breathe again. So that first internal practice is, how are you breathing every day? How are you taking care into your body? I had to pour myself some hot tea after the memorial today to take a breath before I could be with you. The breathing is so necessary. Are you breathing with prayer or poetry or music or song or the sea? How are you breathing? And then when you are ready, how are you pushing for your own self? How are you doing the work of healing or forgiveness or reconciliation or apology? You see, just like in birthing labor, when we are evolving ourselves, it requires us to enter those uncomfortable sensations and thoughts. And that discomfort is not a sign to retreat. No, it's a sign to keep going, my love, because you're in a process of transformation. And in any transition, there are moments where your mind says, I can't keep going. It's too hard. It's too difficult. And so that final practice is about how to tap into sources of wisdom to remember that we are not alone and that we are not laboring alone. That's why we began our hour with connecting through the roots under the earth, each other, and the ancestors at our backs. How can we remember how to call upon each other as midwives while we are showing up to the labor in our lives? So, revolutionary love. I define revolutionary love as the choice to labor for others, opponents, and ourselves. And when you do this, laboring for a more just and beautiful world, it becomes porous enough to let joy in. And that's like the radiant sun over the compass there, the 10th practice. Jamilah, I've come to believe that, as much as I want to do my work on this earth of helping this country transition into a multiracial democracy, I really do want to make it safer for the next generation. But I have to know that the work for justice will go on long after I die. And so how is a labor an end in and of itself? I have come to believe that laboring for a more just and beautiful world with love and with joy is the meaning of life. These practices of revolutionary love, this compass that you all just saw, we are about to release a learning hub next week where we've built it for the last 4 years. There's a educational curricula for educators. There are home practices and guided inquiries and original music and artwork, and it's all free and it's an open platform, and you all can get a sneak preview of it. You can go to my website, valariekaur.com, and click on Learning Hub. It's backed by research and infused with ancestral wisdom. And if any of this speaks to you, I invite you to take it in and as a tool to build beloved community where you are. And if any of this speaks to you, it's because it's just tapping into a wisdom that is already inside of you. Love is our birthright. We are just bringing to the surface what is already yours to know and to do. That was my whirlwind introduction to me.
I love it. And we are linking to this in the chat. So if you are watching this, which we all are, please go to the chat. You can click on it from there. Valarie, you mentioned that this book took many years to write, went through many agents and drafts. I think it's important to sort of break down the process a little bit, because this is a beautiful book and it was a labor of love. So can you tell me how long it took to come to its final form and when you knew that this was the final form?
It's so interesting. I have shame to tell you the truth,
Interesting. Huh.
It's really, yeah. I'm it shouldn't have been so hard. What was wrong with me that it took so long, that it was so hard?
I mean, why wouldn't it have been hard?
But Jamilah, it took 18 years. Like, it was, I was a college kid. I traveled around the country after Bobby's uncle was murdered, collecting stories of hate crimes against my community. This was before social media. There was no way to even make people care. I came back to school and I took my first book writing class in January of 2002. Mm. And Jamilah, I was writing this book. Like, the stories I wrote in that class are in chapter 2. Mm. So every year after that, like, I sent out my honors thesis, I should have saved all the rejection letters. And every year after that, I would live the stories and write the stories and live the stories and write the stories. And it was book proposal, 2005, 2007, 2009, 2013, 2015. And I honestly felt like my fear was that I would die with all the music still inside me. Mm. Like, I knew that these stories, 'cause they weren't just mine, they were my people's stories too, right? I felt like this internal pressure, like again, like I was so pregnant with this book for so long. And when I finally met Chris, who gave me, like, no, now's the time to get it out of you. From that point on, it took 2 years. And it was a year in the rainforest of writing and thinking and building the framework. And then I got pregnant with my daughter, and I was so sick. I had hyperemesis, so I vomited every hour for 4 months. I was in a wheelchair the second half of my pregnancy. The one thing I could do was sit up and write. And people were like, why, how? And honestly, there was part of me that wondered whether I would make it. And I felt like I needed to write what I needed my daughter to know, just in case. So I wrote this book out loud. She was inside of me, and I wrote it primarily as an audiobook. So when Brooke said that she was listening to it, I'm like, yes, that's how my daughter and I experienced it. And so I would listen to it and write it and listen to it and write it and then play it back. It was less like writing, because in the beginning I was trying to sound all literary, and that didn't work. It was more like composing music. The ego got quiet. I just had to say what I needed you to feel. And so in that way, the book spilled out of me, and I had a deadline. I couldn't move, like she was going to come out. So I was at this desk and I wrote the final lines of the book. It was a letter to her, and the epilogue, "May joy be your lifeblood." And Jamilah, I'm not kidding. Like, I kind of hobbled up. I wrote those words. I said them out loud. I hobbled up. I immediately went into active labor, and baby was born 4 hours later.
Oh my God. That's incredible. So one day your daughter's going to read this book. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. But, and I'm just going to say one more note about process. So it did take a very long time. It took someone else to believe in me. And then it was this choice, because was it a memoir or was it a manifesto? I had the stories, but then I had this framework for the ethic of revolutionary love that was, so I didn't know how to balance them. And Chris, was it one or was it the other? And we took a risk and tried to make this hybrid tapestry. And the way that I did it was that I wrote the stories first. Each chapter came out as pure story. And then when I sent it to him, I had another document that was just bullet pointing the ideas that was rising from the stories. All of the ideas are kind of coming from lived experience, and then backed up by all the 40 pages of footnotes in the back of the book. And so he then, when he did a pass on it, gave it back to me, having stitched the ideas into the stories in each chapter. So it was a deeply collaborative process. And each chapter I wrote, again, deadlines, right? I had to call 4 friends who I really trusted to meet me on Zoom at a particular time to read to them chapter 1. And it is the only way it came out, because they were waiting for me, and I would be writing it just the last minute and then deliver it to them. And so that's how I finally got on the cadence after all the writing, to finally just deliver the final form up until baby's birth. And then it was another year of editing, and then that's the book that you have in your hands.
Wow, that's an incredible story. So I have one more question that I want to ask, and then we have some really lovely questions from the audience that I'd like to get to. But I want to ask about what it means to be an ally, and specifically what it what do you do when you make mistakes, when you don't quite get it right, when you don't show up how you want to show up? How do you move between those mistakes and showing up with humility and grace?
Mistakes are so good. Just acknowledging that you're making the mistake is the work. That is the work. You know, I feel like a lot of people I know, in fact, a lot of like people who identify as white will want to show up, want to do the right thing, but be quiet because they don't know the right words or the perfect way to do it. They won't show up because they haven't been invited. They feel like they need permission. And what I think we've seen in the last summer, and certainly, you know, since George Floyd's murder, is a recognition that we need everybody in the uprisings. And the difference, the reason I really love what Indigenous leaders are inviting us into, they're the ones who said not ally, but accomplice. An ally is like someone, the feeling is like you're standing by, you're waiting for permission, you don't want to make mistakes, you're, you know, as opposed to accomplice. No, we need you to conspire with us to do this thing. And that means when you do make the mistake, you can let yourself be swallowed up by your own shame and disappear again, or you can use it as this gorgeous constructive moment to ask, like, to wonder, right? To wonder about yourself, to wonder about others, to then use that as information for how you show up now and next. I keep thinking, Jamilah, that, you know, about this generation of white accomplices and of white people standing up for racial justice. And I think, like, is this the generation? Like, whiteness has always been synonymous in this country with blindness or domination or complicity. What if this was a generation to change the meaning of whiteness? You know, what it means to be white is to be an accomplice, to follow the lead of Black and Indigenous and people of color who are reordering the world to support our visions that leave no one behind. You know, that's the invitation. That is an open invitation. And what I think people are appreciating about this compass for revolutionary love is that everyone has a different role in it at any given time. And so no matter who you are, there's a place where we need you.
So I want to turn to a few audience questions. The first one is from Alejandra, and she asks, how do we address our own complicity in benefiting from strangers being treated poorly? For example, low-wage workers providing us with cheap goods and services. She didn't write this, but I'm just going to say Amazon.
Yeah, I know. Just
all of our Amazon packages.
I know. We just had a set arrive today, and I had this. Oh, my love. We're all complicit, aren't we? And some of us much more than others. And I think the danger in saying, I'm a good person is it shuts down the ability to wonder about ourselves and our complicity. We don't have to let ourselves be dragged down in shame or in guilt once we acknowledge all the ways that we are complicit. We can let that be an invitation to wonder about whose stories you're not yet hearing. Are you really taking in the stories of those low-paid workers who are packaging your packages? Are you taking in the stories from India right now with this COVID surge? You know, in what ways are we complicit in this country in, you know, hoarding supplies that need to go to the developing world? There are endless ways that we are complicit, and I think that the framework invites us to wonder about the stories we have not yet heard, to sit with those stories, like actually reach out to the people in your life to hear those stories, or to find those narratives, those films, those campaigns, those websites, those ways to be able to let the story in, to let it change you. And to listen, you know, listening is an act of surrender. You risk being changed by what you hear. So to open yourself like that is an act of humility. And in opening yourself like that and in letting yourself bear the grief of that, it's a matter of trusting that there's information in that about what you might be called to do next. And each of us can do a thing. So I would go back to the wondering and the grieving and the fighting as ways to orient to all of those strangers whose destinies are bound up with ours, but we haven't quite faced them yet and taken them in and then decided how to show up. There's always an invitation to do that, but there's a breathing and pushing, right? So you rest a little bit and then do it again because it's endless.
Great. Janet asks, what first inspired you to work for and write about racial justice?
Oh, I think that I answered Janet's question in the story about how I was gonna be a professor of religion. That was my and Balbir Uncle's murder, turned me into an activist. It was life and death, really, for all those years. But truly, I'm different than how I was when I started because it was all about my people, my community, and it took me wondering about strangers, wondering about other people, letting in the stories of other communities of color, that I really began to understand that, I need to center Black lives in my work. Anti-Black racism is the foundation for all of the other isms that make people like me unsafe in this country. And so how can I center Black lives in my work? And then how can I begin with Indigenous histories and memories, as a source as a North Star? And then how do I follow the lead of other women of color who know in their body and their breath not to leave anyone behind? And how do I make room for accomplices? And so I think in the course of 20 years, I've learned a lot about, how to fight for racial justice in a way that, lifts up all of us. So I think that you get that when you read See No Stranger too.
We have Lisa who asks, how do we forgive people who have done great harm to us and our communities?
Well, first, my love, you don't have to forgive them. Forgiveness this is what my mother taught me. I remember walking into a bedroom, my grandmother's bedroom, when she was dying, and my mother was dabbing my grandmother's lips to help her die. And I was so confused because my grandmother had always been cruel to my mother. And here was my mother helping my grandmother die a dignified death. And I asked her after she spread her ashes, I said, how did you do that? And she said, I forgave her. I'm like, but how did you forgive her? And she said, forgiveness is for you, not them. Forgiveness is for you. Forgiveness is not forgetting. Forgiveness is freedom from hate, freedom from animosity. And here's what I wish to tell you, that sometimes you need to hang on to your animosity. I tell this story about, being a survivor of sexual violence, like so many women, and I had to hang on to my animosity for my assailant for, 15 years. Until finally, after that moment with my mother, I looked at this thing that I was holding. I'm like, I guess I don't need this anymore. It was the only thing that gave me agency, but I don't need it anymore. I've done the work of healing. So for me, just like with Balbir Uncle's murderer, forgiveness comes at the end of a long journey of healing. My revolutionary love act was to let others tend to my assailants, like other people attend to the man who abused me. Other people in the prison attended to Frank Roque, the killer, right? Let other people do that work. Your job is to heal yourself, and the forgiveness can come at the very end. For others, I think about Charleston, Jamilah, remember? It was just it was so difficult to watch those family members in the wake of massacre forgive Dylan Roof. And I looked at that and I wanted to be like, no. And then I realized no, for them, forgiveness is what initiates the healing process. It's a declaration that you cannot make me hate you. I am sovereign. I choose how I wish to show up in the world. And if I choose love, that means you have no power over me. So I think it's up to each of us to ask ourselves, what is my relationship with forgiveness? And when do I want to free myself from any animosity that I carry? What I wish to tell you is that your healing is not dependent on their apology. And their apology is not dependent on your forgiveness. These are independent processes. It could happen, like forgiveness is something you can do for yourself, right? Reconciliation requires the other person. So in some cases, if the stars align, if you've gone through this process where you have forgiven, and they have gone through this process where they can make apology, then there's a meeting that takes place. And the process of reconciliation can begin, the repair. And I tell some stories where that has happened in my life with Bulbir Uncle's murderer, with my own abuser. And there are other moments for whom, I may never have reconciliation with that person. But I think just the act of, the aspiration of showing up with a kind of revolutionary love, even for them, to see them as wounded, opens up the possibility that it could take place in this lifetime. And I'll say this last thing, Jamilah. The reason I think this is like liberation work, teaching people how to make apology and how to forgive and how to reconcile, is that America needs to reconcile with itself. America needs to make apology and reparation and reimagine. America needs to follow the lead of the people of color it has long oppressed. And how do we do that? How do we learn how to do that? If enough of us, if a critical mass of us can develop these tools, to practice revolutionary love, to build beloved community, to be able to know how to forgive and how to reconcile and how to repair locally, then perhaps we can amass the collective wisdom for us to do that for the nation as a whole. That's my life's work.
And we are all better for it. Christina asks, what's the best way average, ordinary people can make the world kinder?
I go back to that really simple practice. If you walk down the street and you're looking at people, even behind masks, and you say to yourself, okay, sister, brother, sibling, grandfather, daughter, then you are training your eye to see differently, to see no stranger. You're training your heart to love without limit. And just that shift in orientation in your own body, it determines everything. It may not seem like this is just happening inside of me, but it determines where you send your kids to school, what neighborhood you live in, what policies you support, who you vote for, who you stand up for, what communities you see as your own, right? That orientation is everything. And I keep thinking that if a critical mass of us are seeing each other as part of each other, then isn't that the shift in culture and consciousness that might transition our nation, our world as a whole? Anti-racism is the bridge, but love, beloved community is the destination. And I believe that we can start practicing that here and now internally, and that gives rise to the bravery to do the things in our communities, in our schools, in our houses of worship, in our homes, in our workplaces.
Great. And final audience question, Delia wants to know, or this person says, loved the book and hope to practice its teachings. We can choose to be curious about others and our opponents. And how do we make our opponents curious about us? And how do we start dialogue when our opponents don't see us as equal? How do we keep hope for those who have lost all hope of reconciliation?
I want to answer this by telling a story that's not in the book. January 6th, the day of the insurrection, my brother-in-law was trapped in the Capitol building. He's a reporter on CNN, and I was on the phone with his mother and wife, my husband and I, just watching the images. We were shaking, we were sobbing, and just praying that they wouldn't find him, because he was not only a reporter, he was brown. And it was only when he was led to an undisclosed safe location that I could feel what was happening in my body. And I was like, oh, this is terror and this is familiar. How often have I felt this terror in the face of white supremacist violence like this? And I looked at those people covered in the tattoos and waving Confederate flags and heavily armed, and I just felt the rage pounding through my veins. And that night, my friend, one of my best friends, who helped build the Revolutionary Love Project with me, she called me and she said, Valarie, I'm so sorry. My parents were at the Capitol too. And I said, oh my God, are they okay? And she said, no, you don't understand. They were on the outside of the building. So my brother-in-law's on the inside. Her parents are on the outside. And in that moment, Dr. King's line that we are all bound in a single garment of human destiny, I saw it. And as much as I wanted to hate those people, as much as I wanted to see them as monsters, I had to see them through the eyes of their daughter, who saw them as deeply wounded, deeply misinformed, whose racism was just fed all the way up to the presidency. That, again, that didn't make them any less dangerous, but seeing the wound in them, it helped me see that it may not be my job to tend to that wound, but it may be hers. And I've watched her in these last months sit with her parents and struggle, and I've come to realize that, reconciliation may not be possible in this lifetime for her and her parents, that redemption may not happen in this lifetime, but she has learned enough from that wound to not pass it on to her own boys about how to be white in this country. And so what I wish to tell you is that there are some opponents who will not be changed by you, who will not wonder about you. But if your aim is to listen to them, it's a way to not only preserve their humanity, but it preserves our own. And in listening to them, we mirror each other as human beings. If I show up with a dagger, you're going to be daggers out too, right? But if I show up with genuine wonder, then it might be that opponent will start wondering about you too. Start wondering about your story. Start being transformed by what they hear. And then over the course of years, right? It took 15, 20 years with Frank Roque, Bill Beer Uncle's murderer. In the course of years, maybe that man waving the Confederate flag in the Capitol building, I want to open up the possibility in that 15 years he might see me as a sister. I know that's possible because I've seen it. And it may not happen too, right? But if practicing love is an embodiment of beloved community here and now, then it's not only a means to an end, it is an end in and of itself. It's a way to orient to life and to everyone in front of us. And that is enough. That is powerful enough.
Valarie, thank you so much. I feel so privileged and honored to have been in this conversation with you. Thank you for writing, and thank you for your words today. It's been a pleasure.
Jamilah, it means the world. Thank you. Thank you all. And I wish I could see each of your faces and just take your hands on the other side of the screen. But my hope for you is that if there's any piece of wisdom or any story that touched you, that you let yourself hold it and let it carry you through, let it help you breathe when you need it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Valarie, thank you so much to everyone in the audience for coming. This conversation has been, I think, life-changing for many of us. And I hope you'll stick around for other conversation at the festival. I'm Jamilah King, and you've been watching the Bay Area Book Festival. Now let's bring back Brooke, who will tell you what's coming up next.
Thanks for those wonderful questions, Jamilah, Valarie. I'm such a fan. Oh my gosh, you two were so inspiring and heartfelt. And I think we can see from the comments that the audience agrees. So thank you both. To close, I want to let everyone know or remind folks, as the case might be, that the Bay Area Book Festival goes through next Sunday, May 9th, Mother's Day, with at least one great event every day. Just two highlights that I'd like to tell you about tomorrow at 1 p.m. Pacific is Nobel laureate Kazuo Ishiguro live with novelist Ya Gyasi. And looking ahead, if you like tonight's event, we think that you'll love an event a week from today on Saturday night, May 8th. And this features 3 Black poets who are at the vanguard of speaking truths and healing hearts. One of the speakers is Pulitzer Prize winner and past U.S. Poet Laureate Tracy K. Smith, who also speaks and writes about revolutionary love. Your ticket includes a copy of a brand new anthology called There's a Revolution Outside, My Love, that gathers these writers and many more on the nearly unsayable events of 2020. And so please visit baybookfest.org to learn more. Thank you again to the San Francisco Chronicle, Mother Jones, and She Writes Press, as well as the other general festival sponsors for helping bring all of these programs to fruition. In a moment, you'll see a slide to close tonight that directs you to the festival bookstore, Green Apple Books, where we encourage you, please, if you haven't already, buy See No Stranger. And if you already have it, buy it for a friend. Just like Jamilah, I have already given it away to about 3 or 4 different people at this point and loaned my copy since I have my audiobook. So please patronize your local indie bookstore. If you are not going to buy from Green Apple Books, that's important too. We will put a link in the chat. Thank you and good night. And thank you, Valarie.